The torches guttered in the cold desert wind as the old man pressed his forehead against the stone wall and wept. Behind him, Babylon was burning, not in flame, but in something stranger, a silence that had fallen over the greatest city on earth, a silence so absolute that he could hear his own heart hammering against his ribs like a fist against a locked door. The Persian army had entered the gates without a single sword being drawn. The river had run dry overnight. The gods of Babylon, who had ruled the world for 1,000 years, lay shattered on the temple floors, and somewhere in the palace, King Belshazzar's body was still warm. The old man's name was lost to history, but his people were not. He was a Jew, a captive, a man whose grandfather had been dragged in chains from the ruins of Jerusalem 70 years before, forced to weep by the waters of Babylon, forced to hang his harp on the willows and forget the songs of Zion. And now, on this impossible night, a stranger had ridden into the city, a king from the eastern mountains, draped in white linen and crowned with gold. They said he had come to free the captives. They said he spoke of the God of Israel as if he knew him. But what this Persian king would do in the days that followed would not only shatter every law of conquest the ancient world had ever known, it would force the prophets of Israel to do something they had never done before, and would never do again, for any foreign ruler in all of history. It began, as most empires do, with hunger. Not the hunger of the belly, but the hunger of a man who had seen too much of the world and decided it was too small. His name was Cyrus, and he had been born into the dust of a forgotten kingdom called Anshan, nestled in the rocky highlands of what is now southwestern Iran. His grandfather had been a vassal king, a tribute-payer, a bowing servant to the mighty Median Empire that loomed over the Persian tribes like a storm cloud that refused to break. Cyrus's childhood was spent in the shadow of that storm. He grew up watching Median tax collectors ride into his father's villages, watching warriors twice his size demand grain and gold and sons for the Median armies. And somewhere in those years, historians still argue exactly when, something hardened inside him. Not hatred, the chroniclers insist. Something colder and more patient. The certainty of a young man who has decided that the world is wrong, and that he is going to fix it. In 559 BC, when Cyrus was perhaps 30 years old, his father died and the crown of Anshan passed to him. It was, by every measure of the ancient world, a small inheritance. A handful of mountain villages, a few thousand warriors, a treasury that could not have filled a single chamber of the Median palace at Ecbatana. The Median king, Astyages, did not even bother to summon the new vassal to court. It was an oversight he would not live to forgive. Within 9 years, Cyrus had done what no Persian had ever dreamed of doing. He had united the scattered Persian tribes under a single banner, marched north through the mountain passes with an army that grew larger at every village, and met the Median king on a dusty plain near the city of Pasargadae. The battle should have been a slaughter. The Medes outnumbered the Persians 3-1. But somewhere in the middle of the fighting, the Median general, a man named Harpagus, who had his own old grievance against Astyages, turned his troops around and rode them into the Median rear. By sunset, Astyages was a prisoner, the Median treasury was Persian property, and Cyrus had inherited an empire he had not yet conquered. What happened next is one of the strangest moments in ancient military history. Cyrus did not execute Astyages. He did not parade him in chains. He did not burn the Median capital or massacre its people. Instead, he made the deposed king a member of his own court, married into the Median royal family, and absorbed the Median nobility into his own administration. The Medes, who had expected slaughter, found themselves promoted. The pattern would repeat itself again and again, across 2 decades of conquest, and it would become the secret weapon of an empire that would soon stretch from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Cyrus did not destroy what he conquered. He absorbed it. He preserved it. He made the conquered believe, somehow, that they had been saved rather than defeated. By 547 BC, his armies were marching west, into the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the legendary King Croesus, a man so rich that his name became a proverb for wealth in every language of the Mediterranean. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi before the war, and the oracle had told him that if he crossed the river Halys to fight Cyrus, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus crossed the river. He destroyed a great empire. It was his own. Within months, the Lydian capital of Sardis had fallen. Croesus was kneeling at Cyrus's feet, and the gold mines of Asia Minor were pouring their tribute into the Persian treasury. And once again, Cyrus did not kill the defeated king. He kept him as an advisor. There are stories, perhaps legend, perhaps history, that Croesus became one of Cyrus's most trusted counselors, riding beside him through the campaigns that followed, whispering wisdom into the ear of the man who had taken everything from him. But all of this, the rise from the mountains, the conquest of the Medes, the humbling of Croesus, was only the prelude. The real test of Cyrus, the moment that would define him in the memory of half a dozen civilizations, lay ahead of him in the south, on the banks of two ancient rivers, behind walls so thick that chariots could race along their tops. Babylon, the greatest city the world had ever known. A city of perhaps 200,000 souls, ringed by walls that the Greek historian Herodotus would later claim were 300 feet high and so wide that they were said to be impassable to any siege engine ever built. Inside those walls stood the ziggurats of Marduk, the hanging gardens whose memory still haunts the imagination of the modern world, and the gold-plated processional way along which the kings of Babylon had paraded their captives for 2,000 years. Among those captives, for the past 70 years, had been the people of Judah. Their story had begun in catastrophe. In 586 BC, almost 3 decades before Cyrus was born, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had marched on Jerusalem with an army that the Judean kingdom could not hope to resist. The siege had lasted 18 months. By the end of it, the people inside the city were eating things that the prophet Jeremiah refused to name. When the walls finally broke, the Babylonians did what Babylonians always did. They burned the Temple of Solomon. They tore down the walls of the city. They blinded King Zedekiah after forcing him to watch his own sons being executed, and then they dragged the survivors, priests, scribes, craftsmen, princes, across 900 miles of desert in iron collars, and they settled them in the fertile lands beside the rivers of Babylon, where the captives sat down and wept, and hung their harps on the willows, and swore that if they forgot Jerusalem, may their right hand forget its skill. For 70 years they had not forgotten. They had built houses. They had married. They had raised children who had never seen the city their grandparents mourned. And they had waited generation after generation for something none of them really believed would ever come. The man who would shatter that waiting was now camped on the eastern bank of the Tigris, studying maps by lamplight, listening to spies who slipped in and out of Babylon with reports of a kingdom rotting from within. The king of Babylon was a man named Nabonidus, a strange, mystical, half-mad ruler who had abandoned the worship of the city's chief god, Marduk, and retreated for 10 years into the deserts of Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in his absence. The priesthood of Marduk hated him. The merchants hated him. The army was tired and underpaid. The provinces were restless. And the guards of Babylon, the spies reported, had been brought into the capital from every corner of the empire, a desperate, panicked attempt by Nabonidus to consolidate divine power at the moment when his earthly power was crumbling. To Cyrus, it must have looked like a fruit so ripe it was falling from the branch on its own. In October of 539 BC, the Persian army moved. They marched not toward the great walls of Babylon, but toward the river that fed the city, the Euphrates, which flowed directly through the heart of the capital, under the walls, past the temples, beside the palace itself. According to the ancient historians, Cyrus's engineers dug a vast channel upstream, diverting the river into a low-lying basin. Overnight, the water in Babylon dropped from neck-deep to knee-deep, and in the darkness, the Persian soldiers walked into the city along the bed of the dry river. There was a feast in the palace that night. Belshazzar, the king's son, was drinking with 1,000 of his nobles, and according to the book of Daniel, written perhaps by a Jewish scribe who was there, he had ordered the sacred vessels of the Temple of Jerusalem brought up from the treasury, so that he could drink wine from them in mockery of the God of the Jews. The Persian soldiers found him still holding the cup. By morning, Belshazzar was dead, Babylon was Persian, and the captives in their settlements beside the rivers were learning, in scattered whispers, that the impossible had happened. What Cyrus did next is preserved on one of the most remarkable objects in the entire ancient world, a small clay cylinder, about the size of a loaf of bread, covered in cuneiform script, now resting under glass in the British Museum. Scholars call it the Cyrus cylinder. Some historians have called it the first declaration of human rights in human history. The cylinder describes, in Cyrus's own voice, how he entered Babylon peacefully, how he restored the temples that Nabonidus had neglected, how he returned the captured gods of the conquered peoples to their original cities, and, this is the line that has echoed for 2,500 years, how he allowed the deported peoples to return to their homelands. The cylinder does not mention the Jews by name. It does not have to. The book of Ezra, written by a Jewish historian within a generation of the events, preserves what happened in the language of Revelation. Cyrus issued a decree. The people of Judah were free. They could return to Jerusalem. They could rebuild their temple. And, astonishingly, the Persian treasury would pay for it. It is difficult, even at this distance, to grasp how strange this was. Conquerors did not free their captives. Conquerors did not fund the temples of foreign gods. Conquerors did not, as Cyrus's own scribes recorded, return the sacred objects looted by previous regimes to the priesthoods who claimed them. The entire economic and political logic of the ancient world ran the other way. A captive population was wealth. They were labor, they were taxes, they were soldiers, they were leverage against rebellion. To release them was to throw money into the sea. And yet, in the spring of 538 BC, the first caravan of returning exiles left the rivers of Babylon and turned their faces toward the road that climbed up through the desert toward the broken walls of Jerusalem. The book of Ezra preserves the inventory. 5,400 gold and silver vessels returned from the Babylonian treasury, the very cups that Belshazzar had drunk from on his final night. 42,360 men and women, the chronicler counted, along with 7,000 servants and 200 singers. They carried with them the bones of the prophets. They carried the memory of a temple most of them had never seen. They carried a single, almost unbearable hope, that the God who had allowed them to be taken away had now used a foreign king to bring them home. And that, perhaps, is where the story becomes most remarkable, because the Jewish prophets, watching all of this unfold, did something they had never done before. The prophet Isaiah, or the scribe writing in his tradition during the years of the exile, looked at this Persian king, this worshipper of foreign gods, this ruler who did not know the Hebrew scriptures, this man who had grown up in the mountains of Iran sacrificing to fire and wind and sun, and he called him something that the Hebrew language had never applied to a foreign ruler in all its long history. He called him Mashiach, Messiah, the Anointed One. The chapter is the 45th of Isaiah, and it is one of the most theologically explosive passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him. A foreign king, a pagan king, a man who would die still worshipping the fires of his ancestors. And the prophets of Israel called him the Anointed of the Lord, the shepherd of God's people, the chosen instrument of divine deliverance. In the long, fierce, jealous theology of the Hebrew Bible, where foreign kings are almost universally depicted as instruments of wrath or arrogance, the singular exception is this man, Cyrus the Persian. The decree itself, the one that sent the captives home, has come down to us in two slightly different forms, one in the book of Ezra in Hebrew, one in the same book preserved in Aramaic, the diplomatic language of the Persian court. The Aramaic version reads almost exactly like the kind of administrative document Persian archaeologists have dug out of the ruins of Persepolis. The king of Persia decrees, the temple of the God of heaven, which is in Jerusalem, shall be rebuilt. The expenses shall be paid from the royal treasury. The vessels of gold and silver which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple shall be returned. For decades, skeptical historians dismissed the decree as a Jewish invention, a piece of religious propaganda dressed up in royal language. And then, in 1879, an Iraqi archaeologist named Hormuzd Rassam, digging in the ruins of a Babylonian temple, pulled the Cyrus cylinder out of the earth. And on that small clay barrel, in the king's own voice, was the same policy, the same logic, the same astonishing reversal of imperial norms that the Hebrew Bible had been describing for 2,500 years. The skeptics fell silent. The Jewish scribes, it turned out, had been telling the truth. But why? This is the question that has haunted historians for centuries. Why did this man, at the absolute peak of his power, with no military need to compromise, with the wealth of 3 empires now flowing into his treasury, choose mercy when he could have chosen profit? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. Some scholars argue it was pure political genius, that Cyrus understood, in a way few ancient rulers ever did, that an empire of grateful subjects was stronger than an empire of resentful ones. Others point to his own religious convictions. The early Persians worshipped a god of light and truth named Ahura Mazda, whose central command was to oppose the lie, and there is a strange resonance between that theology and Cyrus's willingness to undo the lies of conquest. Still others suggest something simpler and harder to prove, that Cyrus had encountered, somewhere along the road, individuals from the conquered peoples whose suffering he could not unsee. We will never know. The man himself left no diaries, no letters, no philosophical treatises. He left only his actions, and the long shadow those actions cast across every civilization that came after him. The empire he built would last for 200 years. Under his successors, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, it would stretch from the Indus River to the Nile, from the Black Sea to the deserts of Arabia, the largest empire the world had yet seen. It would build roads that connected continents. It would invent the first international postal system. It would establish a coinage that traders used from Greece to India. And then, in 330 BC, a young Macedonian king named Alexander would ride into the burning ruins of Persepolis, weep at the empty tomb of Cyrus, and order it preserved as a holy site even as his own soldiers looted the rest of the city. The Greeks, who had spent 2 centuries fighting the Persians, would write of Cyrus not as a tyrant but as the ideal king. The Greek historian Xenophon would compose an entire book, the Cyropedia, The Education of Cyrus, that would become a kind of manual for kingship, read by Roman emperors, by medieval theologians, by Thomas Jefferson, who owned 2 copies and annotated them in the margins. And yet, for all his glory, the end of Cyrus came in a way that no one expected. In 530 BC, nearly 30 years after the conquest of Babylon, he marched into the steppes of Central Asia to subdue a tribe of nomadic warriors called the Mesoschte, ruled by a queen named Tomiris. The campaign began well. According to Herodotus, Cyrus tricked the Mesoschte forces and captured Tomiris' own son, who killed himself in shame at his captivity. The queen, learning what had happened, sent Cyrus a warning that has come down through the centuries with the cold clarity of prophecy. "Glut yourself with blood," she told him. "I will give you your fill." The 2 armies met somewhere on the eastern bank of a river the Greeks called the Araxes. The battle, Herodotus wrote, was the fiercest ever fought between barbarian peoples. By sundown, Cyrus was dead. Tomiris, when she found his body on the field, was said to have plunged his head into a skin filled with human blood, fulfilling, in the most literal possible way, her own grim promise. The man who had spared so many enemies died on a battlefield far from home, killed by a queen whose name the ancient world would not forget. His body was carried back across the empire to the city of Pasargadae, where his sons had built him a tomb of pale limestone, a small, gabled structure standing alone in the wind, raised on a platform of 6 high steps. The Macedonian Alexander, 2 centuries later, would find that tomb broken into and looted. He would order it restored, and according to the Greek historian Arrian, he would weep before it. The inscription on the tomb, according to ancient sources, read with a simplicity that is almost unbearable for the most powerful king the world had yet known. O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know that you will come. I am Cyrus, who gave the Persians their empire. Do not, therefore, begrudge me this little earth that covers my body. The tomb still stands today. It has survived 2,500 years of conquest, earthquake, and revolution. The bones inside it were stolen long ago, but the structure itself remains, a small, weathered house of stone in the middle of an empty plain in southern Iran. Tourists go there now. They take photographs. Most of them do not know that the man buried there once held the fate of an entire people in his hand, and chose, against every law of conquest and every habit of empire, to let them go home. The captives he freed would rebuild their temple. It would be smaller than Solomon's, plainer, less glorious, and the old men who remembered the original would weep when they saw it, because they knew what had been lost. But the rebuilding mattered. The return mattered. Without it, there would have been no Judaism as we know it. Without Judaism, there would have been no Christianity, no Islam, no monotheism in the shape it now takes across half the modern world. 3 great religions, 4 billion living human beings, owe some quiet, unacknowledged portion of their existence to a Persian king who, on a single morning in the spring of 538 BC, signed a decree he did not have to sign. History is full of conquerors who took. Cyrus is remembered because, at the highest peak of his power, he gave back. He returned what was not his to keep. He sent a broken people home. And he did this not out of weakness, but out of strength so complete that mercy cost him nothing, and yet he chose it anyway, when so few before him or after him ever have. Perhaps that is why the prophets called him Anointed, not because he believed what they believed, but because he did what they had been praying for 70 long years beside the rivers of Babylon, that someone, anyone, might one day do. Until next time, keep reading the scrolls.